Sometimes the longest journey begins with a single decision you almost did not make. Avery Brooks repeated those words silently as she stood inside the nearly empty train station, holding a one-way ticket that represented everything she thought she wanted. A promotion in another state promised a higher salary, greater recognition, and a future that looked perfect on paper, yet something deep inside her refused to celebrate. Outside, a gentle spring rain covered the city's streets with shimmering reflections while commuters hurried toward destinations that seemed certain. Avery glanced at the departure board one last time before stepping outside for a breath of fresh air, telling herself she only needed a minute to clear her thoughts. Across the street, a neighborhood charity festival filled the small town square with music, local artists, food vendors, and families enjoying a quiet Saturday afternoon. Drawn by the unexpected warmth of the gathering, she wandered through colorful booths displaying handmade crafts, photographs, paintings, and books written by local authors. The atmosphere felt strangely comforting, reminding her of weekends from her childhood that she had almost forgotten. As she paused near a photography exhibit, one image immediately captured her attention. It showed an elderly couple sitting on a weathered porch, smiling at one another while watching the sunset. There was nothing dramatic about the photograph, yet it radiated peace, trust, and a lifetime of shared memories. The best stories rarely begin with extraordinary moments, a calm voice said beside her. Most people simply do not notice the ordinary ones. Avery turned to see Madison Carter, the photographer responsible for the exhibit. Madison greeted her with an easy smile that felt genuine rather than practiced. She wore a light denim jacket over a simple white sweater, carried a camera that looked well-used instead of expensive, and spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who truly loved observing people. Their conversation began with photography, but soon drifted toward travel, family traditions, favorite places, and the surprising comfort found in small communities.
Time
Passed almost unnoticed as visitors wandered between exhibits and musicians performed nearby beneath strings of colorful lights. Avery found herself laughing more freely than she had in months, surprised by how natural the conversation felt with someone she had only just met. When Madison asked whether she lived nearby, Avery hesitated before admitting that she was supposed to leave the city within the hour. Madison looked toward the distant train station before smiling softly. Life has a funny way of asking difficult questions when we are already carrying our luggage. The simple observation lingered in Avery's mind long after the conversation shifted to lighter subjects. As the afternoon sunlight slowly broke through the fading rain clouds, children ran across the square chasing bubbles, while local musicians filled the air with gentle acoustic melodies. Avery looked around at the ordinary happiness surrounding her and realized she had not felt this peaceful in years. The departure time on her ticket continued moving closer, yet for reasons she could not fully explain, the destination that had seemed so certain that morning suddenly felt much farther away than the woman standing only a few feet beside her. The festival continued long after Avery realized her train had already departed. Surprisingly, she did not feel panic. Instead, she experienced an unfamiliar calm that seemed to settle over her with every passing minute. Madison noticed Avery quietly checking the departure time on her ticket before gently asking whether missing the train had created a serious problem. Avery smiled with a mixture of embarrassment and relief, admitting that she had been so absorbed in their conversation that she had completely lost track of time. Rather than expressing sympathy, Madison laughed softly and said that perhaps the schedule had simply made a different decision than either of them expected. The remark was lighthearted, yet it lingered in Avery's thoughts. They continued walking through the festival together, stopping to watch local musicians perform beneath colorful string lights while artists demonstrated their work to curious visitors. Every conversation felt effortless. Avery found herself sharing stories she normally kept private, speaking about years spent chasing promotions, endless meetings, and carefully planned goals that somehow left very little room for genuine happiness. Madison listened without interruption, asking thoughtful questions instead of offering quick advice. She explained that photography had taught her to appreciate moments that most people hurried past. A weathered bench, an old bookstore, two lifelong friends sharing coffee, or a child laughing beside a fountain often revealed more truth than dramatic events ever could. As afternoon slowly turned toward evening, Madison invited Avery to visit a nearby riverside overlook that offered one of the city's most beautiful sunset views. The short walk carried them through quiet residential streets lined with blooming trees and welcoming front porches where neighbors greeted one another by name. Avery noticed how different the atmosphere felt from the constant urgency that had defined her professional life. There was no pressure to impress anyone, no race against time, and no expectation that every minute needed to produce measurable success. They reached the overlook just as golden sunlight spread across the river, transforming the water into shimmering ribbons of orange and gold. Dozens of people quietly watched the sunset without speaking, creating a peaceful silence that somehow felt shared rather than lonely. Madison raised her camera, but lowered it again after only a moment. Avery asked why she had decided not to take the photograph. Madison answered that some memories became stronger when they lived only inside the people who experienced them. The response surprised Avery because it reflected a kind of wisdom she had not encountered in a long time. She admitted that for years she had believed every important opportunity had to be seized immediately or risk disappearing forever. Madison smiled gently and replied that meaningful opportunities often returned when people were finally ready to recognize them. As the last rays of sunlight slipped below the horizon, Avery's phone vibrated with a message from her employer asking whether she had arrived safely. She looked at the screen for several seconds before placing the phone back into her pocket without responding immediately. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to sit quietly without rushing toward the next obligation. Beside her, Madison watched the evening sky gradually fill with stars, completely comfortable with the silence between them. Avery realized that although they had known each other for only a single afternoon, the conversation felt more honest than many relationships she had spent years trying to maintain. She still did not know what decision she would ultimately make about her future, but she understood one thing with absolute certainty. Missing that train no longer felt like a mistake. It felt like the beginning of a story she had never imagined herself living. Morning arrived with bright sunshine pouring through the hotel window, and Avery remained awake long before the city stirred to life. The train ticket still rested on the bedside table, now nothing more than a quiet reminder that one unexpected afternoon had completely changed the direction of her plans. Instead of rushing to purchase another ticket, she decided to spend one more day exploring the town before making any permanent decision. After enjoying breakfast at a small neighborhood cafe, she walked toward the weekly farmers market where local residents gathered beneath rows of colorful tents filled with fresh flowers, handmade crafts, baked goods, and seasonal produce. Familiar voices welcomed Madison as she arrived carrying her camera over one shoulder. Vendors greeted her by name, children waved enthusiastically, and several artists invited her to photograph their newest creations. Avery watched with quiet admiration, realizing how deeply connected Madison was to the community around her. There was no sense of performance or obligation in the conversations. Every smile appeared sincere, every greeting effortless, and every interaction reflected years of genuine relationships built through kindness rather than convenience. Madison introduced Avery to friends who owned the bookstore, the flower stand, and the family bakery. They spoke about ordinary subjects, including favorite recipes, upcoming festivals, neighborhood projects, and local history, yet Avery found those conversations surprisingly meaningful. She admitted that in her own professional life, she often recognized job titles before she remembered people's names. Here, everyone seemed to know one another through shared experiences instead of business achievements. Later that afternoon, they visited a quiet botanical garden overlooking the river. Winding stone paths led through blooming roses, flowering dogwoods, and peaceful ponds where ducks drifted beneath graceful willow trees. Madison photographed sunlight filtering through fresh spring leaves before lowering her camera once again. Avery smiled, teasing that she rarely seemed interested in taking as many photographs as people expected from a professional photographer. Madison laughed and explained that waiting for the right moment mattered more than capturing hundreds of ordinary images. The conversation slowly shifted toward dreams they had quietly abandoned over the years. Avery confessed she once hoped to open a neighborhood library before convincing herself that practical careers mattered more than meaningful ones. Madison admitted she had once accepted assignments that paid well but left her feeling disconnected from the people she photographed. They both recognized how easily ambition could become a substitute for fulfillment. As evening approached, they returned to the riverside overlook where gentle breezes carried the scent of blooming flowers across the water. Avery finally checked her phone again and discovered several messages from her employer asking when she expected to arrive. She calmly typed a reply explaining that she needed additional time before making such an important decision. Pressing send felt strangely liberating rather than frightening. Madison did not ask what she had written. Instead, she simply smiled, respecting Avery's choice to share only when she felt ready. Watching sailboats drift peacefully beneath the fading sunlight, Avery realized that certainty did not always arrive with dramatic revelations. Sometimes it appeared quietly through honest conversations, unexpected friendships, and the rare feeling that for the first time in many years, she was no longer running toward a future designed by someone else's expectations, but beginning to listen to the life she truly wanted to build. Several days passed before Avery finally realized that she had stopped counting how long she had remained in the city. The urgency that had once dictated every decision gradually gave way to a quieter rhythm, one shaped by unplanned conversations, familiar streets, and the growing comfort of spending time with Madison. Each morning they discovered another corner of the community together. Sometimes they volunteered at the neighborhood library, helping organize donated books for a children's reading program. Other afternoons they visited local artists whose workshops filled old brick buildings with paintings, pottery, and handcrafted furniture that reflected generations of tradition. Avery found herself looking forward to those ordinary experiences far more than the carefully scheduled meetings that had once filled every hour of her calendar. One afternoon, Madison invited Avery to accompany her on an assignment documenting the annual restoration of a historic riverside theater. Volunteers of every age worked side by side repairing wooden seats, polishing decorative railings, and repainting faded murals that had welcomed audiences for decades. Madison moved quietly through the building, photographing genuine moments of cooperation rather than directing anyone to pose. Avery noticed how naturally people trusted her. They smiled because they were comfortable, not because a camera was pointed toward them. During a short break, they sat together near the theater balcony, overlooking the empty stage. Dust floated through beams of afternoon sunlight, while volunteers continued working below. Madison admitted that she had once considered accepting a prestigious position with a national media company. The opportunity promised travel, recognition, and financial security, yet something had always felt incomplete. She realized she preferred telling stories that strengthened communities instead of simply attracting attention. Avery listened carefully before admitting that she recognized the same feeling in herself. For years she had pursued goals that looked impressive from a distance, while quietly ignoring the question of whether those achievements reflected the life she truly wanted. Their conversation ended not with dramatic promises, but with comfortable silence, as they watched volunteers laugh together while restoring something that mattered to everyone. Later that evening, Avery received a phone call from her supervisor. The promotion remained available, but the company needed a final answer within 48 hours. The conversation was polite and respectful, yet Avery felt the familiar pressure returning almost immediately after the call ended. She thanked her supervisor for the opportunity and promised to respond before the deadline. Madison noticed the thoughtful expression on Avery's face, but did not ask for details until Avery chose to share them during their walk home along the river. After listening carefully, Madison simply said that no meaningful decision should be made out of fear. Whether Avery accepted the promotion or chose another path, the decision needed to belong entirely to her. Those words stayed with Avery throughout the evening. She realized that Madison had never tried to influence her choice. Instead, she had consistently encouraged her to trust her own judgment. Standing on the quiet pedestrian bridge beneath a sky filled with early stars, Avery understood that genuine support rarely sounded like persuasion. It sounded like someone believing you were capable of finding your own answer. As the lights reflected gently across the calm river below, Avery took a slow breath and recognized that although the future remained uncertain, she no longer felt alone while facing it, and that quiet realization carried more comfort than any carefully planned destination ever had. The following morning arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of blooming flowers through the quiet streets. Avery left her hotel earlier than usual, hoping that a long walk would help organize the thoughts that had filled her mind since receiving the deadline from her employer. Instead of heading toward the train station, she instinctively followed the familiar route to the Riverside Cafe, where she and Madison had shared breakfast several times during the past week. Madison was already there, reviewing photographs on her camera while sipping coffee beside the open window. She looked up with an easy smile, greeting Avery as though they had been meeting every morning for years. Neither woman mentioned the difficult decision waiting ahead. They spent the first hour discussing ordinary things, including the changing weather, an upcoming community art fair, and a family of ducks that had recently returned to the river. Avery quietly appreciated the simplicity of the conversation. For the first time in a long while, she realized that silence no longer felt uncomfortable when she was with Madison. Later that morning, they joined dozens of volunteers preparing the town square for the weekend celebration. Colorful banners were carefully hung between historic buildings, wooden tables were arranged for local artisans, musicians rehearsed beneath a temporary stage, and children painted cheerful decorations that would welcome visitors from neighboring communities. Avery happily accepted small tasks, helping arrange flower displays and organize information booths. Several residents thanked her as though she had always belonged there, a kindness that caught her by surprise. Madison watched Avery laughing with local volunteers and quietly captured a photograph before lowering her camera. When Avery noticed, she jokingly asked whether the picture had turned out well. Madison smiled and answered that genuine happiness never needed perfect lighting. Those words stayed with Avery throughout the afternoon. As the sun began to lower across the river, they found a quiet bench beneath an old oak tree overlooking the park. Avery finally admitted how frightened she had become of making the wrong decision. She explained that accepting the promotion promised stability, while staying meant embracing uncertainty without any guarantee that everything would work out. Madison listened carefully before responding that every meaningful chapter of her own life had begun without guarantees. She believed certainty was comforting, but courage often appeared only after people stepped into the unknown. Avery remained silent for several moments, watching children chase colorful kites across the open field while families gathered for evening picnics nearby. The peaceful scene reminded her that many of life's happiest moments could never have been planned months in advance. Her phone vibrated once again with another polite reminder from her company. This time she opened the message immediately, read every word, and then calmly turned the phone face down beside her. Instead of feeling overwhelmed, she experienced an unexpected sense of clarity. Looking toward Madison, she realized that the decision before her was no longer about choosing between two locations. It was about choosing between a future built around expectations and one built around purpose. The answer had quietly been forming ever since the afternoon they first met beside the photography exhibit. As the evening sky filled with warm shades of orange and gold, Avery smiled with a confidence that had been absent for far too long, understanding that whatever choice she made the following day would finally reflect the person she had become instead of the person she believed everyone else expected her to be. The next morning began with unusual clarity, as though the city itself had paused to wait for Avery's decision. She woke before sunrise, opened the curtains, and watched the first rays of light spread across rooftops, church steeples, and the quiet river that had become so familiar in only a few days. Her phone rested on the bedside table beside the unopened folder containing the official relocation documents. For several minutes, she simply stood in silence, allowing herself to experience the rare feeling of not rushing toward the next obligation. After getting ready, she walked to the riverside where Madison was photographing the early morning mist drifting above the water. The peaceful scene reflected perfectly across the calm surface of the river while joggers, dog walkers, and cyclists slowly brought the city to life. Madison smiled as Avery approached, noticing immediately that something had changed. Avery admitted that after weeks of questioning every possibility, she finally understood what had been missing from her life. Success had filled her schedule, but it had never filled her heart. Madison listened quietly, saying nothing until Avery finished speaking. Instead of celebrating too soon, she reminded Avery that important choices deserved complete honesty. If Avery stayed, it needed to be because the decision reflected her own future rather than the influence of anyone else. Those words gave Avery exactly the reassurance she needed. She thanked Madison for never asking her to choose one path over another, only encouraging her to discover which path truly belonged to her. Later that morning, Avery contacted her employer through a scheduled video meeting. With calm confidence, she expressed sincere gratitude for the promotion and the opportunities the company had provided throughout her career. She explained that after careful reflection, she had decided not to relocate because she wanted to build a different kind of life, one that placed purpose, community, and meaningful relationships at the center of her future. Her supervisor appeared surprised but responded with understanding, wishing her success wherever life eventually led. When the call ended, Avery closed her laptop and felt an overwhelming sense of peace rather than uncertainty. She had not chosen the easier road. She had chosen the one that finally felt authentic. That afternoon, she met Madison at the town square, where volunteers had completed preparations for the community celebration. Music floated through the warm spring air, children laughed as they decorated sidewalks with colorful chalk drawings, and local residents welcomed visitors with genuine hospitality. Madison handed Avery a small framed photograph taken during their very first afternoon together at the festival. The picture captured Avery standing quietly in front of the elderly couple's photograph, completely unaware that someone had already noticed the uncertainty and hope reflected in her expression. Looking at the image, Avery smiled with quiet emotion, realizing that sometimes another person recognized the beginning of our transformation long before we did ourselves. As evening settled across the city, they walked once more toward the riverside overlook where their friendship had steadily grown into something deeper through countless conversations, shared silences, and ordinary moments. The sunset painted the sky in brilliant shades of gold, pink, and soft blue, while gentle breezes carried the sounds of music from the celebration below. Standing beside Madison, Avery understood that love was not measured by dramatic promises or perfect timing. It was built through trust, honesty, patience, and the courage to choose a life that reflected who they truly were together rather than who the world expected them to become. Several weeks passed after Avery made her decision, and each new morning confirmed that she had not simply changed locations, but had begun living with a different understanding of success. Instead of measuring her days by completed projects and scheduled meetings, she discovered satisfaction in helping organize the neighborhood library, volunteering during community events, and slowly becoming part of the town that had welcomed her without hesitation. Madison continued documenting local stories with the same quiet curiosity that had first drawn Avery's attention, yet now their routines naturally overlapped. They met for coffee before sunrise, walked along the river after work, and spent evenings discussing books, photographs, and the dreams they had once convinced themselves were unrealistic. Their growing connection felt effortless because it had been built patiently through trust rather than expectation. One afternoon, the director of the Community Arts Council invited Madison to participate in a prestigious traveling photography exhibition that would tour several major American cities over the following year. It was an extraordinary opportunity that many photographers spent their entire careers hoping to receive. Madison accepted the invitation to learn more about the project, but the conversation left her unusually thoughtful. When she finally shared the news with Avery during their evening walk beside the river, Avery smiled sincerely and congratulated her without hesitation. She understood exactly how meaningful the opportunity was, yet after the excitement faded, both women quietly recognized the difficult questions now standing before them. The exhibition would require months of travel, constant movement, and long periods away from the community they had grown to love. Madison admitted that only a year earlier she would have accepted immediately, without a second thought. Now, however, the decision no longer seemed simple. Avery gently reminded her that she should never decline an opportunity out of fear of disappointing someone else. Madison had once encouraged Avery to choose the life that genuinely reflected her heart, and Avery believed the same principle applied now. They sat together on their favorite bench overlooking the river as the evening sky gradually shifted from soft blue to brilliant shades of orange and lavender. Neither woman tried to solve the future in a single conversation. Instead, they allowed themselves the freedom to consider every possibility without pressure. Madison confessed that meeting Avery had changed the way she viewed success. She no longer wanted recognition that required sacrificing the relationships and community that gave her work meaning. Avery quietly admitted that she had been thinking about opening a small reading and creative learning space connected to the local library, a dream she had abandoned years before because it never seemed practical. Madison smiled warmly, encouraging her to explore the idea with the same confidence Avery had shown when choosing an entirely new direction for her life. As they watched the final light disappear beyond the horizon, both women realized they had reached another important crossroads. Unlike the uncertainty they once feared, this new challenge did not threaten to separate them emotionally. Instead, it invited them to imagine a future where personal dreams and shared hopes could exist together without requiring either person to lose their identity. For the first time, they understood that love was not about asking someone to remain exactly where they were. It was about believing that whatever path unfolded next, they would continue encouraging one another to become the fullest versions of themselves while walking toward the future side by side. The following week unfolded with a quiet sense of anticipation that neither Avery nor Madison tried to ignore. The invitation to join the traveling photography exhibition remained on Madison's desk, while sketches for Avery's community reading and creative learning center slowly filled the pages of a notebook she carried everywhere. Instead of treating their dreams as competing paths, they began searching for ways they might support one another without sacrificing what mattered most. Every afternoon they met inside the old public library, where volunteers had recently begun restoring an unused reading room. Dusty shelves were cleaned, faded walls received fresh paint, and large windows overlooking the river filled the space with warm natural light. Avery smiled as she imagined children discovering books there for the first time, while local artists, writers, and photographers gathered to share ideas with neighbors of every generation. Madison quietly photographed the transformation, believing the gradual restoration of the room reflected something equally meaningful taking place within both of them. A few days later, the director of the traveling exhibition arrived in town to discuss the opportunity in greater detail. Rather than insisting on a full year away from home, the director explained that the schedule could be adjusted if Madison agreed to participate in selected cities while continuing her long-term documentary project in the community that had inspired her recent work. The proposal surprised Madison because it created a possibility she had not expected. She immediately looked toward Avery, whose encouraging smile reminded her that compromise did not always weaken a dream. Sometimes it strengthened it by allowing room for everything that truly mattered. That evening they walked beside the river beneath strings of lights preparing for another community celebration. Families gathered along the waterfront, musicians rehearsed on a small outdoor stage, and neighbors greeted one another with familiar warmth. Avery admitted that she had spent years believing every important decision required giving something precious away. Madison replied that perhaps wisdom came from learning which opportunities invited people to grow, without asking them to abandon themselves. Their conversation continued long after sunset, as gentle reflections shimmered across the water. The next morning, Avery presented her proposal for the Reading and Creative Learning Center to the library board. She spoke with calm confidence about building a welcoming place where books, photography, storytelling, and community projects could inspire people of every age. The board members listened attentively before expressing enthusiastic support, offering unused rooms, volunteer assistance, and local fundraising opportunities. Avery left the meeting overwhelmed by gratitude rather than relief. For the first time, an idea that had once existed only inside her imagination had begun taking shape in the real world. Later that afternoon, Madison received confirmation that the exhibition organizers had accepted the revised schedule, allowing her to travel periodically while remaining rooted in the community she loved. Standing together inside the quiet library, surrounded by shelves waiting to be filled with new stories, they realized that neither future had required the other to disappear. Their lives were not becoming smaller because they had chosen love. Instead, their hopes had quietly expanded beyond anything either of them had believed possible. As warm afternoon sunlight filled the restored reading room, Avery and Madison exchanged a peaceful smile, understanding that the strongest partnerships were never built upon sacrifice alone but upon two people encouraging one another to dream without limits while creating a life they were both proud to call their own. The opening day of the new Reading and Creative Learning Center arrived beneath bright blue skies and the gentle warmth of early summer. Neighbors gathered outside long before the doors officially opened, carrying donated books, homemade desserts, fresh flowers, and handwritten notes wishing the project success. Children eagerly pressed their faces against the windows, excited to explore the colorful reading corners that Avery and dozens of volunteers had spent weeks preparing. Standing quietly near the entrance, Avery watched the growing crowd with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. Only a few months earlier, she had been preparing to leave the city behind forever. Now she found herself welcoming people into a place built from a dream she had almost abandoned years before. Madison moved naturally through the celebration with her camera, capturing spontaneous moments instead of arranged photographs. She smiled as grandparents introduced grandchildren to their favorite childhood books, local artists offered free workshops, and musicians filled the rooms with gentle acoustic melodies. Every photograph reflected the same quiet truth that had inspired her work from the beginning. Meaningful stories were created by ordinary people choosing kindness every single day. During the afternoon, the exhibition director visited the center before Madison's first scheduled trip. After walking through the restored building and meeting the volunteers, the director admitted that the community itself explained why Madison's recent work had become so powerful. The photographs carried genuine emotion because they were rooted in real relationships rather than distant observation. Hearing those words reassured Madison that she had made the right decision by reshaping her professional path instead of simply chasing recognition. As the celebration continued, Avery received a letter from her former employer. She opened it quietly, expecting another discussion about career opportunities, but instead found a thoughtful message thanking her for the years she had dedicated to the company and expressing sincere admiration for her decision to pursue a more meaningful direction. The letter ended with an invitation to collaborate in the future if their paths ever crossed again. Avery folded the paper carefully, smiling as she realized that closing one chapter had not required bitterness or regret. Sometimes respect remained even when people chose different roads. Late that evening, after the final visitors had left and volunteers finished cleaning the center, Avery and Madison carried two folding chairs onto the small balcony overlooking the river. Warm lights reflected across the water, while distant laughter from the town square drifted through the peaceful evening air. Madison spoke about her upcoming travel schedule, explaining that each journey would last only a few days before bringing her home again. Avery shared plans for expanding the center with writing groups, photography classes, and weekend programs for local families. They laughed as they imagined children who might someday discover passions that would shape the rest of their lives inside the very rooms surrounding them. Looking across the quiet river, Avery realized that happiness no longer felt fragile or temporary. It had become something steady, strengthened by shared purpose, mutual encouragement, and the confidence that neither of them needed to choose between personal dreams and the life they were building together. The future still held unknown challenges, but for the first time, those uncertainties felt exciting instead of frightening because every new possibility would be explored side by side. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that neither Avery nor Madison had imagined possible only a few months earlier. The Reading and Creative Learning Center quickly became one of the most welcoming places in town. Every morning began with children arriving before school to borrow books, retirees gathering for coffee and conversation, and local artists preparing workshops that filled the building with creativity and quiet optimism. Avery discovered that every day brought a new opportunity to encourage someone else's dream, whether by helping a young student choose a first novel or listening as an aspiring writer shared the opening pages of a manuscript for the very first time. Madison traveled for the opening exhibition in Chicago, documenting neighborhoods, community gardens, and ordinary people whose stories reflected resilience rather than spectacle. Although the galleries received enthusiastic praise, the greatest satisfaction came from returning home after each assignment. During every trip, they spoke every evening, sharing photographs, stories, and simple details from their days. The conversations reminded both of them that distance measured in miles did not weaken the trust they had patiently built together. When Madison returned after her first exhibition, the entire community welcomed her back during the weekend farmers market. Neighbors asked about her travels while children eagerly searched through printed photographs she had brought to display inside the learning center. Avery watched quietly from across the room, smiling as Madison effortlessly connected distant experiences with the people who had inspired her work from the beginning. Later that afternoon, the mayor announced a regional cultural initiative supporting towns that promoted literacy, local history, and community arts. The Reading Center was invited to apply for funding that could expand its programs throughout the county. Avery immediately recognized the opportunity, yet she also understood the responsibility that would accompany such growth. Instead of making the decision alone, she gathered volunteers, teachers, librarians, artists, and longtime residents for an open discussion. Every voice was welcomed, and every suggestion was carefully considered. Madison photographed the meeting only after asking permission, believing that collaboration itself deserved to be remembered. By the end of the evening, the group agreed to move forward together, determined to preserve the welcoming spirit of the center even as it reached more families. Walking home beneath a sky filled with bright summer stars, Avery admitted that she once believed leadership meant carrying every burden alone. Madison gently replied that true leadership often meant trusting others enough to build something together. Avery realized how profoundly her understanding of success had changed. Recognition no longer mattered as much as seeing children discover confidence through stories, neighbors support one another through shared projects, and visitors leave believing that ordinary kindness could transform an entire community. As they paused on the familiar bridge overlooking the river, warm lights shimmered across the calm water while laughter drifted. From the town square, Madison reached for Avery's hand, and together they watched the reflections move gently with the current. Neither woman spoke because the silence itself carried quiet certainty. The future still promised new responsibilities, unexpected challenges, and opportunities neither could fully predict, yet every step ahead would be taken with the same values that had brought them together from the very beginning: honesty, compassion, curiosity, and the unwavering belief that the most meaningful journeys were built one ordinary day at a time. Autumn arrived almost unnoticed, painting the Riverside Park with brilliant shades of amber, crimson, and gold, while cool breezes carried the scent of fallen leaves through the town. The Reading and Creative Learning Center had become a place woven naturally into everyday life. Students gathered after school to finish homework, local authors organized weekend discussions, photographers displayed community exhibitions along the walls, and families spent quiet afternoons discovering stories together. Avery often paused near the entrance before opening each morning, grateful that the dream she had once hidden inside an old notebook had become a welcoming home for so many people. Madison continued balancing her photography exhibitions with life in the community, returning from each assignment carrying new stories that inspired workshops for aspiring photographers. Rather than speaking about awards or recognition, she encouraged students to notice ordinary moments that revealed kindness, resilience, and hope. Her lessons became unexpectedly popular because they reminded people that meaningful photographs were created through patience and genuine curiosity rather than expensive equipment alone. One afternoon, the Regional Cultural Foundation announced that the center had been selected to receive its largest community development grant. The funding would allow new classrooms, expanded literacy programs, accessible technology, and traveling educational workshops for neighboring towns. The announcement filled everyone with excitement, yet Avery immediately understood that growth also required thoughtful planning. Instead of celebrating alone, She invited volunteers, teachers, artists, librarians, and residents to gather around a large table inside the center. Every idea was welcomed. Every concern was respectfully discussed, and every decision reflected the shared belief that the center should always remain a place where every visitor felt valued. Watching the meeting unfold, Madison quietly realized that Avery had become the kind of leader she had once doubted she could ever be. Later that evening, they walked through the nearly empty town square beneath strings of warm lights, swaying gently in the cool autumn breeze. Local musicians packed away their instruments after an outdoor performance, while cafe owners stacked chairs along quiet sidewalks. Avery admitted that she sometimes worried success might slowly change the atmosphere they had worked so hard to create. Madison smiled and reminded her that buildings could become larger, programs could reach more people, and opportunities could continue expanding, but kindness was always a daily choice. As long as they protected that simple principle, the heart of the center would never be lost. Those words brought Avery a quiet sense of peace. They continued toward the familiar Riverside Bridge, where reflections of colorful trees shimmered across calm water beneath a sky filled with early evening stars. Looking across the peaceful landscape, Avery reflected on the woman who had once measured every accomplishment by promotions and professional titles. That version of herself now felt like a distant memory. She had learned that fulfillment was not found in reaching the highest position, but in creating opportunities for others to discover their own potential. Madison gently reached for Avery's hand as they watched the final leaves drift across the river. Neither of them knew exactly what the coming years would bring, yet both understood something far more important. Their lives had grown stronger not because every challenge had disappeared, but because they had learned to face each new season with honesty, compassion, shared purpose, and the quiet confidence that whatever changed around them, the values that first brought them together would continue guiding every step they took from that day forward. Winter returned with quiet grace, covering rooftops, riverside paths, and the surrounding hills with a gentle layer of fresh snow that transformed the familiar town into a peaceful landscape of white and silver. Inside the Reading and Creative Learning Center, warm lights glowed through every window, welcoming visitors who escaped the cold to enjoy books, conversations, workshops, and the comforting sense of belonging the building had come to represent. Avery arrived before sunrise each morning to prepare the fireplace, arrange new arrivals on the bookshelves, and place handwritten recommendations beside her favorite novels. She often smiled while watching children hurry inside with rosy cheeks, eager to discover another adventure waiting between the pages of a book. Madison had recently returned from another successful photography exhibition, bringing with her a collection of portraits celebrating small communities across the country. Instead of presenting distant landmarks or famous attractions, every photograph focused on ordinary people helping neighbors, preserving traditions, and creating meaningful connections through simple acts of generosity. The exhibition quickly became the centerpiece of the Learning Center, inspiring conversations that lasted long after visitors finished viewing the final image. During one particularly busy afternoon, an elderly woman quietly approached Avery carrying a small envelope. She explained that months earlier she had attended a writing workshop at the center after losing confidence in her lifelong dream of becoming an author. Encouraged by the kindness she found there, she had completed her first children's book and recently signed a publishing agreement with a regional press. The envelope contained the very first printed copy, along with a handwritten note thanking Avery and everyone who had created a place where hope felt possible again. Avery accepted the gift with quiet emotion, realizing that the greatest measure of success could never be calculated through awards or statistics alone. It lived inside moments like these, when another person's future changed because someone had chosen to believe in them. That evening, the entire community gathered for the annual winter celebration inside the beautifully decorated center. Evergreen wreaths, handmade ornaments, strings of warm lights, and the gentle sound of a local choir filled every room with festive warmth. Families shared homemade meals while children listened to volunteer storytellers reading classic holiday tales beside the fireplace. Madison photographed the evening sparingly, choosing instead to simply experience many of the moments with Avery. As the celebration gradually came to an end, they stepped outside into softly falling snow. The streets were peaceful, illuminated by historic lanterns reflecting across the white landscape, while distant church bells echoed gently through the crisp night air. Walking slowly toward the familiar Riverside Bridge, Avery admitted that she sometimes wondered how differently life might have unfolded had she boarded that train on the day they first met. Madison smiled gently before answering that life often offered countless possible futures, but happiness usually grew from the one people chose with courage rather than certainty. They stood together watching snowflakes drift across the quiet river, grateful not only for the dreams they had achieved but also for the countless ordinary days that had quietly shaped those dreams into reality. In that peaceful silence, surrounded by a community that had become family, Avery understood that the greatest journey of her life had never been measured in miles traveled. It had been measured in trust earned, friendships built, hope restored, and the extraordinary beauty found within an ordinary life shared with someone who had taught her that every meaningful beginning started with a single honest choice. Spring returned almost exactly 1 year after Avery first stepped off the train with no intention of staying. The riverside town awakened once again beneath flowering trees, bright morning skies, and the familiar sounds of neighbors greeting one another as they opened cafes, bookstores, and family businesses. Standing outside the Reading and Creative Learning Center, before sunrise, Avery watched the first rays of light reflect across the river and smiled as children began arriving with backpacks full of borrowed books ready to exchange for new adventures. Inside, every room carried quiet evidence of the life they had built together. Fresh flowers decorated reading tables, photographs from Madison's community exhibitions filled the walls, handwritten stories from local students covered a display near the entrance, and shelves once nearly empty now overflowed with donated books from families who believed in the center's mission. Nothing about the building felt extraordinary because of expensive materials or grand architecture. It felt extraordinary because every corner reflected countless acts of generosity shared by ordinary people. Madison returned home that afternoon after completing another photography project, carrying a small package wrapped in plain brown paper. She explained that while traveling, she had visited dozens of remarkable communities, yet every journey reminded her that the place she most looked forward to photographing remained the one waiting beside the river. Together they opened the package inside the quiet library after visitors had gone home for the evening. It contained a beautifully printed collection of photographs documenting the transformation of the town over the past year, beginning with festivals, volunteers, restored buildings, children discovering books, artists teaching workshops, families gathering for celebrations, and ending with one simple photograph Avery had never seen before. It showed her standing beside the old photography exhibit on the afternoon they first met, quietly studying the portrait of the elderly couple while sunlight streamed through the gallery windows. Madison admitted she had taken the picture almost instinctively because something about Avery's expression suggested that an important chapter was about to begin. Avery looked at the photograph for a long moment before laughing softly through grateful tears, realizing that the beginning of her happiest future had arrived disguised as an ordinary day. Later, that evening the community gathered outside the center to celebrate its first anniversary. Music drifted through the warm spring air while neighbors shared homemade meals, children performed songs they had practiced together, and local authors signed books inspired by workshops held inside the building. As darkness settled, hundreds of small lanterns illuminated the riverside, reflecting gently across the calm water that had quietly witnessed every important conversation, every difficult decision, and every hopeful beginning. Standing together on the familiar bridge, Avery and Madison watched the celebration continue below. Neither woman spoke immediately because words were unnecessary. They understood that the greatest gift life had offered them was never perfect certainty or flawless timing. It was the courage to welcome unexpected change, the patience to build trust one day at a time, and the willingness to choose love not as a dramatic destination but as a quiet commitment renewed through ordinary moments. Looking toward the peaceful town that had become their home, Avery realized the journey had never truly been about finding a different place in the world. It had always been about discovering the version of herself capable of embracing hope, sharing kindness, and believing that the most meaningful stories were written not by extraordinary events but by two ordinary people choosing, every single day, to walk into the future together.